yields are coming down. But if you look at the changes here, and you mentioned it earlier in your briefing there, that the euro is the big number. That's the big currency which is making the difference here. The euro now above 111, and that is the one that is now taking the driving seat in terms of pushing currencies. That's where people are now looking for direction. The euro typically is the second largest currency in most weightings. When people do their baskets of currencies, because it's such an important one, they put that usually number 2 after the US dollar. So that means that when there's traction for euro strength, it has a significant impact because it will pull up most other currencies with it. It will pull up all the Asian currencies, a lot of Latin American and Eastern European currencies as well, not to mention the rest of G10. So they will also be in the slipstream behind the euro. And the numbers are pretty large. We've already seen that people are taking larger and larger option positions on the euro. And in fact, even in the data, the weekly data, there are still some short positions among leverage traders. So they need to squeeze those as well. That's a further impetus for the euro. And on top of that, it looks as though the ECB will not be as dovish as the Fed over the next few months. So when Christine Lagarde speaks in September, she may well say that's the last cut for this year. And that is not what people expect from the Fed. So that again is a boost for the euro. This is the big change that's taking place in the currency market. Watch the euro from here. It's going to be driving the currency world.
111 is where we trade. Mark Cranfield, our MLive strategist, we thank you as we await potentially Christine Lagarde putting her foot down in Frankfurt in September. But let's get now to the US politics. It's day 2 of the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, and Barack Obama has told his fellow Democrats that the US is ready for Kamala Harris to become the next president. He said the torch had already been passed to Harris, and he took aim at the Republican nominee, Donald Trump.
We do not need 4 more years of bluster and bumbling and chaos. We all know that the sequel is usually worse. America's ready for a better story. We are ready for a President Kamala Harris.
Let's get analysis now with Bloomberg's Vonnie Quinn. Vonnie, I'm feeling the 2008 vibes. Harris is bringing in the veterans from the Obama White House and his campaign. But I wonder how much the electorate's changed in the 16 years since then.
Surely it has changed, Lizzie, but one thing for sure, that Obama coalition that helped elect him the first time round is still there and is still there for the taking. And that's what all of these veterans of the Obama campaign that you say have been brought on to Kamala Harris's campaign, such as David Plouffe, for example, who ran the 2008 campaign, that's what they'll be targeting. And the DNC has told us that 20 million people across networks watched the first night of the DNC, which is more than watched the RNC's first night by more than 2 million. So this is being watched by the American public. And you saw Michelle Obama and then Barack Obama whip up that crowd tonight and really just inject some urgency into this campaign. That coalition that I was talking about, the coalition that elected Obama the first time and the second time in 2008 and 2012, you're talking about, multi-ethnic, multi-generational voters, particularly though black people. We know that black men have been moving away ever so slightly from Democrats to really suggesting that they might actually vote for Donald Trump. 1 in 5 registered black voters in swing states say that now, though that was before Biden pulled off the ticket. So they'll want to get back some of those voters. Also, they'll want more independents and suburban white voters.
Well, speaking of Trump, he's casting himself as a purveyor of common sense. I wonder whether you think that'll be an effective counter when you've got Harris and Tim Walz, her running mate, taunting Trump and his running mate, J.D. Vance, saying that they're, quote, weird.
Exactly. And in fact, the Harris campaign really seems to be leaning into this weird meme, right? They keep just sort of dismissing the opponent as, well, he's the weird one. And it's needling Trump, you can absolutely tell. His advisors have obviously told him to dial back his rhetoric and to talk about himself as being, a sensible human being. We saw this yesterday when he spoke about the Federal Reserve and said, he was just jawboning with the Fed president when he was in office. This time in Michigan on Tuesday, he really did lean into trying to rebrand himself as, somebody who isn't as much interested in forays into culture wars and so on. And he wanted to appear level-headed. He said, I am not a radical at all. I'm just a common sense person that was successful. Now, whether that is believed by his voters, or whether they even want to hear that from somebody like Donald Trump is definitely up for question.
All right, one of our reporters summed this election up well, I think. He said it's dominated more by the vibes than the policy. Let's see how that continues over the next few days of the DNC. Vonnie Quinn, we thank you for keeping across it all for us. And let's take a look at some of the other things we've got on the docket today. Before market open, we have the results from Macy's and Target, a bit more of a read on the health of the US consumer. And then at 12 p.m. London time, we're going to get more ECB speak from Governor of the Bank of Italy, Fabio Panetta. That'll feed into the euro picture, perhaps, that we were discussing with Mark Cranfield. And then finally, at 7 p.m. London time, it is the Fed minutes for July. Do they change the rate cut bets before we hear from Powell on Friday? You can get a roundup of the stories you need to know to get your day going in today's edition of Daybreak, and Terminal subscribers can find it by going to DAYB Go. But coming up on the programme, US Secretary of State Antony Blinken leaves the Middle East empty-handed. No ceasefire deal for Gaza yet, and both Israel and Hamas signalling major obstacles remain. We'll get into the detail next. This is Bloomberg.
DOJ or other authorities
could face bigger challenges next.
It was going to keep Rain World Cup. This is a 3
as the economic picture.
Covering the intersections of Hollywood, Silicon Valley, and beyond.
The countdown is on. Everything you need to get the edge at the end of the market day.
Big tech earnings kick off later this afternoon.
Gilead is coming out right now.
We have Take-Two numbers. Back to the markets, right? Our bread and butter.
NVIDIA is one of the best stories in the tech space.
That actually matters a whole lot more.
It might shock some of your viewers.
You're watching The Close.
Get ahead of tomorrow's trading with The Close. Weekdays on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Welcome back to Bloomberg Daybreak Europe. It's 6:15 a.m. in London, but to the Middle East now, where US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has left without securing a ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas. After spending Tuesday meeting with Egyptian and Qatari officials, he emphasized the urgency of reaching that agreement.
Our message is simple, it's clear, and it's urgent. We need to get the ceasefire and hostage agreement over the finish line. And we need to do it now. Time is of the essence.
Still, Hamas has pushed back against US claims that it's stalling the talks, saying it's keen to reach an agreement. Let's get more now from Galit Altstein. She's in Tel Aviv for us. Galit, if not Israel, if not Hamas, who or what is standing in the way of a deal at this point?
Yes, so let's start out by saying this morning that the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has left the Middle East last night without achieving a ceasefire deal between Israel and Hamas. The two sides were supposed to start a new round of negotiations in Cairo this week, but no date has been set for that as of yet. After initial reports did talk about that happening today or by the end of this week at most. On the table now is a bridging agreement, which is an extension of a proposal that was laid out by U.S. President Joe Biden last May. That was already 3 months ago. And according to Secretary Blinken, during his visit to the region, Israel has said yes to that bridging agreement, and now it is Hamas's turn to abide by that. Now, the main sticking points are, once again, Hamas's demand that a ceasefire be permanent, while Israel's Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, insists on preserving Israel's right to resume the fighting after a temporary ceasefire that will last about 6 weeks. And there are also tensions over Israel wanting to keep troops stationed along the Gaza-Egypt border to prevent weapon smuggling. That also includes the very strategic Rafah crossing. Now, Hamas has refused to take part last week in the Doha talks, and now they say that the bridging agreement is far from the Biden outline that was presented in May, and they refuse to abide by what they call new demands that are being put forward by Israel. So the bottom line is that we have no agreements, no date for renewed talks in Cairo, and no knowledge that this time Hamas will participate in talks if they actually resume. And at the same time, efforts are still being made to make these three things happen. These efforts are led by the U.S. and mediators, Qatar and Egypt.
So no agreement, no date. Does that make an Iran strike more likely?
Yeah, so that's a very good question, because on a larger scale, these ceasefire talks that are not picking up at the moment, they do affect not just Gaza, but also other fronts. And that is why it has been repeatedly said that a ceasefire in Gaza could prevent wider regional escalation. On that note, Hamas is thought by some to be stalling because its leader, Yahya Sinwar, wants other fronts to flare up in a way that would potentially devastate Israel, like the ongoing front with Iran-backed Hezbollah along Israel's northern border that's been active since October 7th, and possibly even a direct front with Iran itself. Now, we've been talking for months on the fire exchanges between Israel and Hezbollah, and those are still escalating as we move forward. Just to give a sense, yesterday, 125 missiles and 3 drones were fired at Israel from Lebanon, while the Israeli army attacked Hezbollah targets very deep into Lebanon, as far as 100 kilometers away from its border with Israel. There's also anticipation, as you mentioned, ahead of an expected Iranian retaliation against Israel after a senior Hamas leader was assassinated in Tehran in recent weeks. Israel is being blamed for that, although it has not claimed responsibility for that publicly. So now Iran says that could take a while, and time is on its side. But that, as well as a promised Hezbollah retaliation for a different assassination of one of its military leaders, are still very much on the agenda and expected more if a ceasefire deal in Gaza isn't reached.
Okay, Bloomberg's Galit Alstein, we thank you so much for that update. But it does look like traders are focusing more on the demand story around China and the US than the geopolitical tensions. You're looking at Brent trading weaker, 0.1%, still hovering around $77 a barrel. Now to trade. The world's biggest shipping centres are getting caught in the crossfire of intensifying geopolitical conflict. And today's Big Take looks at just how the ports have turned to these strategic battlefields as global powers use them to defend their economic interests. Our senior economy and government reporter, James Mager, joins us now from Beijing. James, just talk to me about how the ports are jockeying for influence in these volatile regions.
So a number of, many countries around the world are trying to develop their port infrastructure for a number of reasons. One of them is, as you say, geopolitical influence, geopolitical control. It's also because during the pandemic we saw that there weren't enough ports, and they didn't have enough capacity to deal with the sudden spike in global trade that we saw, especially across the Pacific, but also in other places as well, which is one of the causes of the inflation that has been rampant over the last few years in the US and Europe. And so, countries and some companies are trying to develop ports. You're seeing, big new ports being opened up in Peru, in South America. There's a big new port being developed in India as well. There are other places around the world where people are trying to both build out their infrastructure so they don't see those kinds of backlogs of hundreds of ships waiting to get into a port to unload their cargo, but also so that they can take more control of the trade that they do from more distant places. I mean, India, for example, doesn't have a big deep water port that's sufficient for the trade that it's doing. So a lot of that trade has to go through other places like Colombo, the port in Sri Lanka, Singapore. So to get more control of their own trade, people are trying to develop their infrastructure. And then also that development then is becoming a point of contention. Specifically, if you see the port in Peru, which is built by a Chinese company, it's being run by a Chinese company. The American government is very unhappy about that because obviously for more than 100 years now, the U.S. government has seen South America as part of sort of an American sphere of influence. But the Peruvian government says that U.S. companies weren't willing to develop that asset for them, and so they had to turn to a Chinese company to build that. So these kinds of necessary infrastructure development are getting caught up in these geopolitical tensions as well.
All right, James Mager, our senior economy and government reporter, we thank you for that preview of the big take. It's well worth a read. It's on your terminal now. Coming up on the programme, as Mpox spreads in Africa, the focus turns to securing enough vaccines on the continent to stop that outbreak. We'll bring you the latest next. This is Bloomberg.
Mayan technology, but they still had to get in the last word. Mainstream said, sure, they had hundreds of miles of roads, but they didn't have vehicles. They just walked. No animals or people pulling carts. They just walked hundreds of miles. Big Archaeology said this is because the Mayans didn't discover the wheel. But Mayan toys have been discovered that have wheels. Big Archaeology says the Mayans never thought to scale them up to put them on carts. How do we know this? Big Archaeology says we know this because we haven't discovered the carts. Oh. But a year ago, Big Archaeology would have said there's no way the Mayans could have built a highway system. Why not? Well, because we haven't found one. Yet there it is. Big Archaeology is quick to take a lack of evidence at face value, regardless of common sense. Like there was no such thing as the city of Dwarka, the advanced and prosperous city in India that was consumed by a great flood. That was all a myth. Then Dwarka was found and dated to the Younger Dryas. There's no such thing as Atlantis, but it's hard to explain the Bimini Road in the Bahamas, or the ancient city off the coast of Cuba that could be anywhere from 6,000 to 50,000 years old. There's no such thing as Mu, the continent that once connected Greece to Easter Island. Yet the languages from those two cultures share about 1,000 words. And the Yonaguni Monument off the coast of Japan is right where Mu would have been. There was no such thing as Derinkuyu. Dwarka, the advanced and prosperous city in India that was consumed